Soldiers digging, not building walls, not forging weapons, digging. A deep trench in baked earth, extending in one direction, then turning at a sharp angle, then continuing outward. Foremen move between the working teams with measuring ropes, checking geometry, adjusting the line. Soldiers lift heavy clay in the summer heat. The work is precise, deliberate. Someone designed this carefully. And the men doing the digging know it, because the shape they are cutting into the ground is not the shape that soldiers normally cut when they are simply trying to protect themselves. There is intention in it, purpose. Something is being built here that goes beyond a wall or a ditch. Then a rider comes in from the south, moving fast. He says something. Workers stop. Heads turn. On the horizon, dust. Not wind-driven. Too low. Too methodical. Too sustained. The kind of dust that a very large army raises when it moves across dry ground in column, an enormous smear of brown-grey haze that grows slowly and doesn't scatter. Men who have served on this frontier all their lives know exactly what that kind of dust means. It is the summer of 530 AD. This flat plain sits in what is now southeastern Turkey, in the modern province of Mardin, near the edge of what was, at the time, one of the most violently contested frontiers in the world. To the east, barely visible on a clear day, the towers of Nisibis, a major Persian city, the center of Sassanid power in this region, the city from which Persian commanders have been projecting military force westward for generations. To the north, close enough to be a comfort and far enough to be a worry, the limestone walls of a Roman fortress called Dara. And in between, on this open and utterly unremarkable ground, a group of soldiers who have spent the last several days making the earth into something it was not before they arrived. The dust cloud in the south is growing. It will not stop growing. What these men are, digging that specific shape, those precise angles, the way the trench turns and extends and turns again, is not what it appears to be from a distance. It looks defensive. It looks like the work of men who know they are outnumbered and are doing what soldiers do when they cannot match the enemy's numbers. They put something between themselves and danger. It looks like caution, like fear, maybe. It looks like a commander who has calculated his odds and found them discouraging. It is not caution. It is the most carefully designed killing ground that had been constructed in this part of the world in centuries. Every angle has been chosen, every gap has been placed, every contingent of soldiers assigned to a specific position within a system that, on the surface, looks like a simple defensive arrangement and is, in its full geometry, something else entirely. And the man who designed it is not standing behind the walls of the fortress. He is out here, on this flat ground, watching his soldiers finish the last sections of work, watching the dust on the horizon deepen and spread, and waiting with the kind of patience that very few commanders in history have managed to maintain in the minutes before a battle they are expected to lose. He has somewhere around 25,000 men. The army raising that dust cloud has at least twice as many. Possibly more. The sources disagree on the exact figure, and ancient military accounts tend toward exaggeration on both sides, but the disparity is not in question, and the Persian army is not simply larger. It contains some of the finest heavy cavalry in the known world, battle-tested and professionally disciplined, led by a senior commander who has, apparently, already sent a message ahead of his arrival asking that the bathhouse be prepared. He plans to use it this evening, before a single sword is drawn, before a single formation has clashed, before one man on either side has fallen. The Persian commander has scheduled his bath. Before a single sword is drawn on this plain, this battle has already been decided. Not by courage, not by numbers, not by the will of God, or the blessing of emperors, or the righteousness of any cause. By a shape in the ground. This is not the story of a siege. There are no city walls falling here, no battering rams grinding against gates, no catapults flinging stone. This is the story of a man who looked at a flat, featureless plain, a piece of ground that offered him no hills to anchor on, no river to protect his flank, no forest to hide his movements, and decided that the way to defeat an army twice his size was to redesign the terrain itself, with shovels and measuring ropes, before the enemy arrived, and then sit behind what he had built, and wait, and let the other side's professionalism do the rest. The name of that man, and exactly what he built, and why it worked in the specific way it worked, is what the next hour is about. Start with the ground itself, because the ground is everything in this story. The fortress city of Dara had no business existing where it did. Built in a hurry in the year 505 AD, it sits just 18 kilometers west of Nisibis, an ancient and important Persian-controlled city in Mesopotamia, one of the major administrative and military centers of the Sassanid frontier. 18 kilometers. On a modern road, that distance takes perhaps 11 minutes to drive. In the 6th century, it is close enough that Persian commanders stationed in Nisibis can look west on a clear morning and see Dara's walls catching the light, and feel the irritation of that view deep in their professional judgment. There was, in fact, a formal treaty between Rome and Persia dating back to the year 441 that specifically forbade either side from constructing new fortified positions in the Mesopotamian border zone. The logic of the treaty was simple: new fortresses changed the strategic balance of a frontier that both sides had spent decades learning to live with. New fortresses mean new threats, new pressure, new reasons to start wars. So, both sides had agreed, no new fortresses. Emperor Anastasius of Byzantium built Dara anyway. He moved fast, mobilizing construction workers and materials from across Mesopotamia, taking advantage of a moment when the Persian king Kavad was occupied with military troubles of his own in the east. The new city went up quickly. It was built on 3 hills, with the highest point occupied by a citadel and the lower levels filled with storehouses, public baths, and cisterns designed to hold water through a long siege. It became, within a few years of its founding, the administrative capital of the Roman province of Mesopotamia, the seat of the Byzantine military command on the eastern frontier. The Persians noticed. They did not forget. They never formally accepted Dara as a legitimate Byzantine possession. To Persian strategic thinking, that fortress 18 kilometers from Nisibis was a provocation built from limestone, a statement of Byzantine ambition driven into the frontier like a stake. This matters because it sets the stage for what we are watching in the summer of 530. The soldiers digging that trench are not digging on safely Roman soil, in the defended heart of Byzantine territory. They are digging in a contested space at the very edge of Persian strategic influence, with the enemy's major regional city close enough to see on a clear day. Defending Dara was already, in itself, a form of aggression. Holding this city was a political statement made every single morning simply by being there. Now, why were Rome and Persia fighting at all in the summer of 530? The short answer is that they were almost always fighting. The Sassanid Persian Empire, which had replaced the older Parthian dynasty in the 3rd century of the Common Era, was one of the 2 great powers of the late antique world. The other was the Byzantine Empire, the eastern successor to Rome, its capital Constantinople on the Bosphorus, its language increasingly Greek, its church firmly Christian, but its institutions, its law, and its sense of historical identity still deeply Roman. These 2 powers had been grinding against each other across the Mesopotamian frontier, the Armenian highlands, and the Caucasus passes for generation after generation. Neither could destroy the other. Both were too large, too deeply entrenched, too capable of absorbing punishment and continuing to fight. The war kept starting and pausing and starting again, driven by trade routes and tribute arrangements, and the loyalties of the small client kingdoms that sat between the 2 giants and made their choices accordingly. The immediate cause of this particular war, the conflict historians call the Iberian War, which ran from approximately 526 to 532, traced back to a small Christian kingdom in the Caucasus region, not the Iberian Peninsula of Spain and Portugal. The Caucasian Kingdom of Iberia, occupying territory that is now part of the modern Republic of Georgia. For decades, Iberia had been a Sassanid client state, a kingdom that paid tribute to Persia and acknowledged Persian overlordship while maintaining its own king and institutions. The arrangement had worked, more or less, as long as neither side pushed it too hard. Then the Persian king Kavad I attempted to push it. He sent instructions that the Christian kingdom of Iberia should adopt Zoroastrianism, the Persian state religion. This was not a suggestion, it was a demand backed by the full weight of Persian military power. The Iberian king refused. He also fled, moving his court toward Byzantine protection rather than waiting to see what Kavad would do next. Kavad was furious. The Byzantines accepted the refugees. What had begun as a dispute over a client kingdom's religious practices had become an international confrontation between the two greatest powers of the age. And then Kavad tried something that might have resolved the crisis if it had worked. He approached the Byzantine court with an unusual proposal, that the Byzantine emperor Justin I formally adopt his son, the young prince Khosrow, as a recognized political heir. On its surface, this was a diplomatic gesture. In practice, it was a succession maneuver. Kavad was aging. His choice of Khosrow as his successor was not universally accepted within the Persian court. By securing Byzantine endorsement, by having the Emperor of Rome formally recognize Khosrow, Kavad hoped to give his preferred son protection and legitimacy that would be harder for Persian factions to challenge. Justin refused. His nephew Justinian, who was already the effective co-ruler and who would become sole emperor in 527 after Justin's death, refused as well. The proposed adoption was rejected firmly and diplomatically, which is to say, it was rejected in a way that left no room for ambiguity while maintaining the forms of courtesy. And what might have been a workable peace, a shared investment in Khosrow's future, collapsed. The war began in earnest. The early fighting did not go well for the Byzantines. Roman generals were sent to raid into Persian territory, demonstrating Byzantine resolve on the frontier and testing Persian defenses. Among them was a young officer named Belisarius, making his earliest appearances in the historical record on this eastern frontier. The raids accomplished little. A Persian army under a prince named Xerxes, son of Kavad, destroyed a Byzantine force at a place called Thanuris in the year 528, using a stratagem involving the manipulation of terrain, a detail that is worth remembering, because it will appear again in a different form. The Byzantines had been beaten. Twice in the opening years of the war, they had come off worse. By 530, Kavad had decided to move decisively. He dispatched a large army toward Dara. The sources suggest somewhere around 40,000 soldiers under a senior commander bearing the title of Mirans. The intention was transparent: neutralize this Roman forward base that the Byzantines had spent 2 decades building and garrisoning, demonstrate Persian military superiority on the Mesopotamian frontier, and perhaps take the fortress itself if the opportunity presented itself. Justinian, now emperor in his own right, and acutely aware that his reign needed military credibility, sent his general back to the eastern frontier with reinforcements and a co-commander named Hermogenes. The general he sent was Belisarius. He was born somewhere in the frontier provinces of the empire Thrace or Illyria, most likely, in what is now Bulgaria or the Western Balkans. The exact location of his birth is not clearly recorded, and some later traditions assign him origins that modern historians treat skeptically. He was born probably around the year 500 AD. That would make him roughly 30 years old at Dara. Perhaps a few years younger, the chronology is not precise. What the sources agree on is the outline of his early career: modest provincial origins, enlistment in the imperial guard under the Emperor Justin, rapid advancement through a combination of tactical intelligence and personal loyalty that was, apparently, difficult to ignore. By the time Justinian became emperor, Belisarius had become indispensable. Procopius of Caesarea, who serves as our primary guide to everything that happened at Dara, was not a random historian writing from a distance. He was Belisarius's personal legal advisor, a trained lawyer attached to the general's personal staff, traveling with him on campaign, present at or near many of the events he later described. Between 527 and 531, Procopius was with Belisarius on the eastern frontier. He may have been present at the Battle of Dara itself, or at minimum received accounts from men who were. His narrative of this engagement is among the most detailed descriptions of a late Roman battle that survives from this era. Procopius is invaluable. He is also not neutral. He was writing about his patron, a man he admired deeply. He also wrote, separately, a vicious secret history attacking the Emperor Justinian and the Empress Theodora, which demonstrates that he was capable of extreme positions in both directions. His numbers should be treated as estimates. His more literary flourishes, the dramatic champion combats, for instance, should be held at a certain interpretive distance, but his description of the battle's tactical mechanics, cross-referenced against the landscape that modern scholars have analyzed with satellite imagery and field visits, holds up as essentially reliable on structural matters. Belisarius at Dara did not command alone. Justinian had sent Hermogenes alongside him as co-commander, and the presence of Hermogenes was not incidental. A general in his late 20s or early 30s, being given independent command over the Byzantine eastern frontier, required institutional oversight, someone with imperial authority and seasoned experience who could validate decisions, check impulses, and represent the emperor's interests. The trench system that defines this battle was not Belisarius's unilateral gamble. It was a strategic decision arrived at jointly, approved by two senior officers who looked at the situation together and concluded that the standard playbook was not going to be enough. The force under their command was built from elements that did not naturally fit together. There were regular Byzantine cavalry-mounted soldiers capable of both archery and shock combat, reasonably equipped and trained, but not exceptional by the standards of the era. There was Byzantine infantry, and here the sources are blunt about the problem that Belisarius faced. These were not the disciplined heavy infantry of an earlier Rome. The great legions of the Republic and early Empire, the formations that had ground their way across Europe and the Middle East for centuries, were gone, or survived in name only as poorly trained garrison forces posted along frontier walls. The infantry available at Dara were soldiers accustomed to holding city walls, not to standing in open formation against cavalry charges. Procopius describes them as unreliable in the open field. This was not an insult. It was a tactical assessment, and Belisarius made his entire design around it. Then there were the allies. The Foederati allied peoples who fought under Byzantine pay and command, but were not formally part of the imperial army. Hunnic horse archers from the steppes north of the Black Sea. Superb cavalry, mobile and deadly with the composite bow, organized in small groups under their own commanders. At Dara, roughly 600 in total, divided between 4 officers, Sunikas and Agan commanding the contingent assigned to the left flank, Simas and Ascan commanding the group on the right. The Heruli, a Germanic tribal people who had settled within Byzantine territory and supplied elite warriors as allies. Approximately 300 cavalry under a commander named Pharas, who would play a role in this battle that no one standing in the Persian camp that morning could have anticipated. And the Ghassanid Arabs, Byzantine clients, under their Phylarch al-Harith ibn Jabalah, providing mobile cavalry support that extended the Byzantine reach on the flanks. Finally, and most importantly for the battle's outcome, the Bucelari, Belisarius's personal household regiment. These were soldiers recruited, trained, equipped, and paid by Belisarius himself from his own resources, a practice that was legal and indeed encouraged in the 6th century Byzantine military, where the state's capacity to field and maintain regular forces had atrophied significantly. The Bucellarii were the best soldiers in the Byzantine army of this era, fully armored in the manner of heavy cavalry, armed with composite bows as well as lance and sword, trained to fight in multiple styles depending on the tactical situation, and personally loyal to the commander who had built them. At the peak of his career, Belisarius would command 7,000 Bucellarii. At Dara, the force was smaller. The exact number in 530 is not recorded, but they were his finest instrument, and they would be held in reserve under John the Armenian, his most trusted subordinate, until the single moment when their commitment would determine the outcome. Against all of this, the Persian army. The Sassanid military of the 6th century was organized around the Savaran, the Persian heavy cavalry. These were the armored knights of the Sassanid system, noblemen who trained from youth in horsemanship and combat, equipped with lamella or scale armor for both rider and horse, fighting with lance, sword, mace, and composite bow. The Savaran were the backbone of Persian military power, and they were formidable. Roman commanders had been studying how to fight them, and occasionally how to defeat them, for centuries. They were not invincible, but they were among the finest heavy cavalry in the known world, and the Persian forces at Dara contained large numbers of them. And there were the Jayadan, the Immortals, 10,000 elite armored cavalry in the Sassanid tradition, the direct institutional descendants of the famous Persian Immortals of the Achaemenid era, though now mounted rather than infantry, heavy lancers, well armored. Equipped with the composite bow as well as close combat weapons, kept in reserve for decisive engagements, not deployed casually. The Immortals were the force that Persian commanders committed when they needed to break an enemy formation that had survived the initial pressure. When the Immortals moved, armies tended to break. Their commander at Dara bore a senior title and the expectation fully justified by the numbers and the quality of his force that he would not need to commit them at all. The battle should have been decided before that. Belisarius looked at this inventory, his own force and the one approaching, and understood his problem with complete precision. He could not retreat inside Dara's walls and wait. The fortress was not large enough to comfortably hold his entire force for an extended siege, and a purely defensive posture would surrender strategic control of the Mesopotamian frontier indefinitely, which was exactly what Justinian's strategic situation could not tolerate. He could not meet the Persians in open field with his cavalry. His numerical disadvantage in horsemen was too severe, and the quality gap between Sassanid heavy cavalry and Byzantine regular cavalry was real. He could not deploy his infantry in open ground against Sassanid cavalry without expecting them to break. He needed to fight. He needed to win. And he needed to do both without giving the Persians the battle they had been trained for generations to win. The answer was already forming in his thinking, and it involved a shovel. Understanding what Belisarius built at Dara requires first understanding what the Sassanid cavalry did when it fought, because the entire design of the trench was built around anticipating that behavior and using it against itself. The Savaran and the Immortals were professional warriors who followed professional doctrine. Their standard approach to a battlefield engagement had been refined over centuries of fighting on the Mesopotamian plain and the adjacent terrain of Syria and Armenia. Probe the enemy flanks to identify weakness. Apply pressure on the weaker flank to create a gap or force the enemy to thin his line to respond. Commit the heavy cavalry through the gap to exploit the opening. Sweep wide with flanking cavalry to envelop and collapse the enemy formation. Hold the elite, reserve the Immortals until the enemy line has been destabilized and there is a moment to deliver the killing blow. This doctrine had worked. It had worked against Roman forces many times. It had worked at Thanuris 2 years earlier, where Byzantine troops had been cut apart. It was based on sound military principles: mass, momentum, concentration of force at the decisive point. It was not a secret. Every Byzantine officer with any experience on this frontier understood exactly how the Sassanid cavalry intended to fight. And Belisarius designed the trench to make that doctrine into a trap. The principle was simple, even if the execution required precision. In order to execute a flanking maneuver on open ground, cavalry needs space. They need room to sweep wide of the enemy's flanks, to build up speed and momentum, to come around the end of the enemy line at an angle that makes defense difficult. If you take away that space, if you alter the physical shape of the ground so that cavalry attempting to sweep wide runs into an obstacle instead, you force them into a narrower channel. In a narrow channel, the advantages of mass and momentum are compromised. Numbers that would be overwhelming in open ground become less decisive when the geometry limits how many riders can bring their weapons to bear simultaneously. That is what the trench accomplished, but not in a simple, straight-line way. Procopius describes the shape of the trench at Dara in enough detail that military historians have been analyzing it ever since, and recent landscape archaeology scholars, combining his textual account with satellite imagery and field visits to the site, has helped to confirm and clarify the picture. The trench was not a single straight ditch running across the front of the Byzantine position. It was more complex than that, and the complexity was the point. In the center, running perpendicular to the direction from which the Persian army would advance, a straight section of trench. This blocked direct frontal assault against the Byzantine infantry positioned behind it. But the trench did not simply terminate at each end. At each end of the center section, it turned at a sharp right angle, a lateral extension running out to the sides, perpendicular to the center line, and from the far end of each lateral extension, the trench turned again, resuming the original direction and continuing outward for a significant distance on each flank. Looked at from above, the shape would resemble something like a bracket, or a pair of interlocking C-shapes opening toward the Persian line, or if you prefer, an elongated letter H rotated sideways. The center bar of the H ran across the front. The uprights of the H extended forward and outward on each flank, enclosing a zone of ground between the center trench and the outer extensions. The effect of this geometry was precise and deliberate. Persian cavalry attempting to sweep around the Byzantine left flank would not find open ground on the far side of the Byzantine position. They would find the lateral extension of the trench continuing outward, blocking their path unless they either crossed it under fire or funneled through one of the deliberate gaps in the ditch. The same on the right. The flanking maneuver that Persian doctrine called for, the wide sweep that had beaten Byzantine forces before, was constrained, redirected, channeled into specific passages that the Byzantine commander controlled. The gaps in the trench were part of the design. The ditch was not a solid wall. Passages had been left through it, deliberately, to allow Byzantine cavalry to move in and out, to counterattack when the moment came. But those gaps were narrow. Persian cavalry, attacking in formation at combat speed, could not pass through them without slowing, compressing, losing the coherence and momentum that made a cavalry charge effective. They would have to approach the gaps at reduced speed, in reduced formation, at exactly the moment when forces positioned on the interior of the trench zone could engage them under optimal conditions. There is a scholarly argument, put forward by the historian Irfan Shahid, that Belisarius may have derived this tactical concept from what the Persians had done at Thanuris 2 years earlier, that he studied a Persian victory over his own side, understood the terrain manipulation that had made it work, and adapted the principle for his own use. This is one scholar's interpretation, not an established consensus, and it should be held as such rather than stated as fact. But if it is true, what it means is remarkable. A Byzantine commander who sat with a Persian defeat of his own army turned the principle inside out and used it to build a trap for the force that had originally invented it. The rest of Belisarius's career suggests that this kind of thinking was entirely consistent with how his mind worked. Now, where did he put his soldiers, and why? Behind the center section of the trench, positioned close enough to the walls of the Dara fortress that the archers stationed on the city's battlements could fire over their heads into the ground in front of them, Belisarius placed his infantry, his weakest arm. The garrison soldiers that Procopius had identified as unreliable in open-field combat. Here, protected by the trench in front and the fortress walls at their backs, they were not in open-field combat. They were in the one configuration where their limitations had been architecturally neutralized. If Persian cavalry somehow forced through the center ditch, which would require crossing it under fire and then fighting through a narrow gap, those Byzantine infantry would have supporting fire from the battlements above them. And if the infantry broke anyway and ran, the city gates were immediately behind them. This was not an accident of positioning. Belisarius had thought carefully about where to put soldiers who might not hold, and he had placed them where their breaking would not be catastrophic. On each flank, outside the main trench sections, Belisarius positioned his regular Byzantine cavalry, not his best troops, not the reserve. These were soldiers good enough to engage a Persian flanking attack, to slow it, to absorb its initial pressure. They were also soldiers who were expected to give ground when that pressure became too much. The retreat was built into the plan. When the Persian cavalry hit the Byzantine outer flanks and pushed them back, that was not a failure. That was the first movement of the system working. Inside the trench angles, inside the cross-sections, where the lateral extensions created enclosed interior, ground invisible from the Persian side, the Hunnic horse archers, Sunikas and Agun, with roughly 300 riders positioned in the interior of the left flank's trench zone. Simus and Ascan, with the same number in the equivalent position on the right. These riders were not positioned where a conventional commander would put mobile cavalry outside the trench, free to maneuver on open ground. They were inside the trench system, in the enclosed dead ground that the geometry created, in the positions where Persian cavalry that forced the outer ditch and entered the trench zone would find them waiting from a direction the attack formation had not anticipated. Behind the center right of the Byzantine line, commanding the Belisarius, John the Armenian, Belisarius's most trusted lieutenant, his boyhood friend, according to some sources, the officer he trusted with the most important assignment in the entire disposition. John would not move. He would not commit his soldiers until the order came directly from Belisarius. The Belisarius were the final card held in reserve against the moment of maximum crisis, when everything else had either held or bent, and one concentrated blow could end the battle. And then Faris. Faris the Herulian commanded approximately 300 Heruli cavalry, Germanic fighters who had settled in Byzantine territory and served as allied soldiers, known for ferocity, speed, and the kind of irregular fighting ability that made them useful in situations where disciplined formation cavalry might fail. Belisarius did not place Faris on the visible battlefield at all. He positioned him and his 300 riders behind a hill on the extreme left of the Byzantine position, completely out of Persian sightlines, invisible from the Persian camp at Amodius, sitting in silence on the other side of a hill that, to Persian scouts, appeared to be an unremarkable piece of terrain with nothing behind it. 300 riders, the single component of the entire Byzantine system that existed completely outside Persian knowledge. The piece of the trap that no amount of professional reconnaissance could account for, because it was not where professional reconnaissance would think to look. The trench was finished. The force was placed. Every element of the system was in position. Belisarius and Hermogenes walked the line, reviewed the deployment, confirmed the plan. The city gate stood open behind the infantry. The hill on the left showed nothing. The system was ready. Now all it needed was the Persian army to enter it. The Persian army arrived and made camp at a place the sources call Amodius, situated roughly 3.5 kilometers south of Dara's gate. At least 40,000 soldiers, probably more. The camp was large enough that its perimeter would have stretched for a considerable distance across the plain, and its fires after dark would have been visible from the fortress walls as a long glow on the southern horizon. Perozes, the Mirins. The senior Persian field commander had every reason for confidence. He had twice the men. He had better cavalry. He had the professional track record of a military that had been winning engagements on this frontier for years. His camp was well ordered, his troops were rested from the march, and his immortals had not yet been committed to anything. He sent a message forward to Belisarius. He would like the bathhouse prepared. He planned to use it that evening. Consider what this message means, beyond the surface arrogance of it. Perozes was not being foolish. He was making a calculated psychological move, sending a taunt to a commander with half as many soldiers, in the hope of undermining whatever confidence that commander had managed to build in his troops. And he was also, at some level, expressing what he genuinely believed, that this battle was already decided, that the question was not whether he would win, but how quickly. and that planning his post-victory bath was a reasonable way to spend the morning. From where he stood, with 40,000 soldiers at his back and an enemy who had been on the losing side of this war for years, the arithmetic was not subtle. Belisarius wrote back. His reply, preserved in Procopius's account, which is the only source we have for it, is not the response of a man who is frightened, though it could easily be read that way. He wrote about peace. He argued, with apparent sincerity, that conflict between the two empires was wasteful and destructive for both sides, that rational men should prefer negotiation to battle, and that the truest measure of a great general was not his victories on the battlefield, but his ability to bring war to a peaceful conclusion. The letter, as Procopius quotes it, includes the observation that the first blessing is peace, as is agreed by all men who have even a small share of reason. A young commander, sitting behind a carefully designed killing ground, he has spent days preparing, writing a letter urging his enemy not to attack. The irony is so precise it almost seems staged, and perhaps, in Procopius's literary reconstruction of events, some of it is. But what the letter represents is real, regardless of how faithfully it preserves Belisarius's actual words. A commander who had made his preparations and was genuinely willing to avoid a battle if the enemy would allow it, while also being completely ready to use those preparations if the enemy would not. The man who wrote the letter about peace had already built the trap. He was not bluffing. He was offering the Persian commander a choice. Perozes chose the bath. Whatever negotiations followed, and the sources suggest some amount of exchange before the fighting started, they failed. The battle would happen. But not immediately. The first day brought something characteristic of warfare on this frontier: individual combats between champions. Single riders from each side meeting between the lines, testing each other with the formalized displays of courage that both cultures valued and practiced. It was not a trivial ritual. How these encounters went would be read by the soldiers on both sides as a signal about the morale and fighting spirit of each army. Procopius tells a story about the champion combats that has fascinated readers for 15 centuries and troubled careful historians for almost as long. A Persian warrior, mounted and armored, issued a formal challenge to the Byzantine side to send out a champion. According to Procopius, the man who accepted the challenge was not a trained soldier at all. He was a bath slave, a domestic servant, apparently, who had been secretly training with Belisarius's own household troops. The man's name was Andreas. He accepted the challenge. He fought. He killed his opponent. Later in the same day, a second Persian champion came forward. Andreas killed that man too. Procopius uses this story for obvious reasons. It is the kind of story that gets told around fires for decades. A bath slave, defeating the pride of Persian chivalry twice in the same afternoon, on the eve of a battle that everyone expected the Byzantines to lose. It carries the message that even the least of the Byzantine side was more than the Persians had anticipated. It has the quality of legend, and that quality should give us pause. Another source, believed to be based on official Persian records rather than on Procopius's literary account, does mention individual combat at Dara, but places it at a different stage of the battle and makes no reference to any man named Andreas. This does not necessarily mean the story is false. It means the sources do not fully agree, and that Procopius, who was a skilled writer as well as a historian, may have shaped the account for maximum literary effect. The single combats almost certainly happened in some form. The details, especially the bath slave winning twice, require the reader to hold them at a cautious distance. They are a good story. They may or may not be a precise account. Both armies returned to their camps at nightfall. No general engagement had taken place. The trench was intact. The forces were in position. The trap had not yet been entered. Overnight, something significant changed. 10,000 more Persian soldiers arrived from Nisibis, marching the 18 kilometers from the Persian city to reinforce Perozes. Fresh troops, joining a force that was already at least twice the size of the Byzantine army. By the morning of the second day, the Persian force numbered somewhere around 50,000 men, possibly more, given the uncertainty of the sources. The Byzantine force had not changed in size. The gap had widened while Belisarius slept. But while Persian reinforcements marched in from the east, something else was happening in the Byzantine camp. In the dark hours of the night, quietly and without torchlight, Faraz moved. He and his 300 Heruli cavalry took position behind the hill on the far left of the Byzantine line. They had not been there on day one. The Persian camp, looking across the plain at the Byzantine disposition come morning, would see the same formation it had observed the previous day. The left flank looked unchanged. The right flank looked unchanged. The infantry stood behind the center trench as before. What the Persian command could not see was what was behind the hill. Day 2 opened with both armies forming up, the Byzantine force in its prepared positions, the Persian force in its greatly expanded strength. The plain between the two camps was flat and clear and warm with early summer light. The battle opened, as most battles of this era opened, with archery. Both sides had substantial numbers of bowmen, and the Persian force had more. By the raw arithmetic of an arrow exchange, the Persians should have dominated this phase of the engagement, softening the Byzantine lines before committing their cavalry and improving the odds of the attack that would follow. The morning brought wind, a strong wind, blowing across the plain in a direction that worked against the Persian archers, disrupting trajectories, scattering volleys, reducing the weight and accuracy of the Persian archery before the cavalry moved. Both sides suffered light casualties in this exchange, but the Persian archery advantage, which might have meaningfully weakened the Byzantine cavalry on the flanks before the assault, was largely neutralized by a weather condition that Perozes had no way to plan for and no means to address. After this exchange, Perozes ordered the Persian line forward. The first major attack went against the Byzantine left flank. This was the professionally correct choice, and that is worth emphasizing, because the story of what happened at Dara only makes complete sense if you understand that Perozes was not making stupid decisions. He was making good decisions. He was making exactly the decisions that a competent, experienced Sassanid cavalry commander was trained to make in this tactical situation. The Byzantine left flank was the standard target for a flanking maneuver on this terrain. There was enough space on that side to sweep cavalry wide, force around the outer edge of the Byzantine position, and begin the process of envelopment that Sassanid doctrine called for. Pityaxes, commanding on the Persian right flank, led the assault, supported by Kadiseni Arab cavalry on his own flank. The Persian cavalry hit the outer Byzantine left, and the Byzantine cavalry there, under a commander named Buzes, did exactly what Belisarius had designed them to do. They absorbed the initial pressure and gave ground. The Persians forced a crossing of the trench. They pushed through the outer Byzantine line. They were inside the Byzantine position. From where Perozes was watching, the left flank attack was working. His cavalry had forced the ditch. The Byzantine outer cavalry was falling back. The envelopment was developing as planned. What Perozes could not see was what was waiting inside the trench zone. The Persian cavalry that had crossed the ditch were not behind the Byzantine position in the way that a successful flanking maneuver leaves an attacker behind the enemy's line, with open ground and exposed flanks in front of them. They were inside the trench system, inside the enclosed angles created by the lateral extensions, in compressed ground, where the geometric shape of the ditch limited how many riders could maneuver effectively and from which directions they could fight. And in those enclosed angles, in the positions that looked empty from the Persian side of the ditch, were Sunikaz and Agan with their 300 Hunnic riders. The Huns did not charge in the way that heavy cavalry charged. Hunnic horse archers fought in a different mode, circling at controlled distances, shooting composite bows with lethal accuracy, shifting position to maintain advantageous angles, hitting and moving and hitting again. In the compressed space of the trench interior, with the geometry of the lateral extensions limiting the Persian cavalry's ability to maneuver to a position where they could effectively engage or pursue, The Hunnic archery was devastating. The Persian riders who had successfully crossed the ditch found themselves in a space that had been designed to hold them in place and expose them to fire from directions their formation could not effectively answer. And then, from behind the hill on the far left, Faris. 300 Heruli cavalry came around the hill and struck the Persian left wing from the outside, from the flank, from the direction of a hill that had appeared to have nothing behind it throughout the previous day and that morning. The Persian force that had pushed through the Byzantine outer cavalry, confident it was executing a successful envelopment, found itself simultaneously under Hunnic archery from inside the trench zone and under a flanking cavalry strike from a direction it had no reason to expect, compressed from inside, struck from outside. In the compressed space between the trench geometry and Faris's charge, the Persian left wing's options for response were severely limited. The Persian left wing retreated. Not a rout, these were professional soldiers, part of one of the best organized armies in the world, and professional soldiers do not rout from a single reverse. They pulled back in reasonable order, disengaging from the positions that had become untenable. But the attack had failed. The left flank had been repulsed, the Byzantine left still held, and the entire sequence from the 1st Persian cavalry crossing the ditch to the retreat of the left wing had played out almost exactly as the trench system had been designed to produce. Perozes assessed the situation. His left had failed. His right had not yet engaged. He still had the immortals uncommitted. He made the decision that experienced commanders make when an initial attack has been repulsed and they have an elite reserve. Escalate. Commit the force that has been held back precisely for moments like this one. If the regular Savaran cavalry could not break through the left, the immortals, the finest unit in the Sassanid army, would break through the right. He ordered them forward. The Jayadan had been watching the left flank engagement from their position in the Persian center. 10,000 armored cavalry, the finest soldiers the Sassanid system maintained, armored riders on horses whose chests and flanks were protected by their own barding, lance and composite bow and sword. The unit kept in reserve for the decisive moment of an engagement, the force that the Sassanid military system treated as the blade that ended battles. They had not been used yet. Their commitment now was the signal that Perozes intended to end this battle with a single, overwhelming stroke. The immortals struck the Byzantine right flank. The weight of this attack was different from the left flank assault. The immortals were heavier, better armored, better trained, and committed in greater numbers than the cavalry that had hit the Byzantine left. The Byzantine cavalry defending the right section of the ditch were pushed back harder and faster than Buzez's men had been pushed back on the left. The Byzantine right line began to buckle in a way that looked, from the fortress walls, like the beginning of a genuine collapse. Persian forces pushed into the trench zone on the right, pressing through the gap they had created in the outer Byzantine cavalry, driving toward the positions where the reserve and the center infantry were positioned. This was the battle's most dangerous moment. This was the instant that the entire design had to either hold or fail, because the immortals were the best Perozes had, and they were committing everything. From his position somewhere behind the Byzantine center, where he could see the full battlefield, Belisarius made two decisions simultaneously. They came quickly, because they had to. There was no time for extended deliberation. First decision: Sunikas and Aegon, who had just helped repel the Persian left wing, were redirected. They had done their work on the left flank had held. Now the crisis was on the right. Sunikas and Aegon moved across the Byzantine position from left to right, behind the center trench, under fire, but moving with the discipline of cavalry that knew exactly what it was doing to join Simas and Ascan on the right side of the trench zone. All 4 Hunnic commanders, all 600 Hunnic riders, concentrated now on the right flank interior. This was the mobile reserve being redeployed in real time, under battle conditions, from a position that had already been contested to a position that was being contested now. It was a risk stripping the left interior of its protective screen to reinforce the right, but Belisarius had judged that Perozes would not send a second force against the already repulsed left wing. He was correct. Second decision: John. Release the Busalari. John the Armenian received the order. Belisarius's household cavalry, his most experienced soldiers, his most heavily armored riders, the men who had been standing behind the center-right line, in exactly this reserve position since before the battle began, entered the engagement on the right. They did not charge directly into the Immortals' advancing face. They hit the Persian force from the flank, from the side, at an angle, in combination with the Hunnic archery that was now converging on the right interior from the repositioned left flank riders. The Immortals, driving hard into the Byzantine right and pressing the advantage of their initial breach, found themselves simultaneously under cavalry pressure from the flank and archery from the interior of the trench zone. Two forces, from two directions, neither of which had been visible in the position they were hitting from when the Immortals began their advance. The Persian force split. Part of the Immortals continued pressing forward, pushing the retreating Byzantine cavalry further back, pursuing what looked like a developing rout on the Byzantine right. Part of the Immortals was caught in place, pinned between the trench geometry that limited rearward movement, the Hunnic archery converging from the interior, and the Belisarius striking from the flank. The part that was caught could not effectively maneuver. They had done what the left wing had done. They had entered the trench zone with momentum and found that the geometry of that zone removed the conditions that made their momentum useful. In the midst of this compression and confusion, the Persian second-in-command was killed. Belisarius, described in the sources as one-eyed, bearing a senior command title in the Sassanid military hierarchy, was killed by Sunekas. A named general, a senior officer, the man responsible for coordinating the Persian forces, struck down at the moment of maximum disorder, at the precise point where the Persian advance was being split and the initiative was reversing. The death of a commander in that specific situation is not merely a casualty. It is a signal that propagates through a force instantly. Something has gone wrong at the highest level. The soldiers around Belisarius felt it. The ripple of that knowledge moved outward through the Persian formation. The part of the Immortals that had been pursuing the retreating Byzantine cavalry on the right had gone too far forward. They were extended, out of communication with the center, unable to return quickly to support the forces that were now collapsing behind them. The retreating Byzantine cavalry, who had been drawing the Persian pursuit, deliberately stopped retreating. They turned. The units that had been running turned to face the men who had been chasing them, and the equation reversed entirely. Across the Persian right, cohesion broke. Not everywhere at once, professional armies do not collapse like a single structure falling. It came in pieces. Units that still had officers and maintained their order began pulling back toward Ammonius. Units that had penetrated deepest, that had followed the Byzantine cavalry furthest forward, found themselves surrounded on three sides and without support behind them. The killing zone that Belisarius had designed played out in its final form, not as a static ditch stopping an army, but as a three-dimensional enclosure that the Persian army's own tactical instincts had led it into, step by step, decision by decision, each choice individually correct and cumulatively fatal. Byzantine pursuit was limited. The cavalry was exhausted. It had fought two major engagements in rapid succession, repositioned under pressure, and absorbed the sustained assault of the Sassanid Immortals. There were no fresh reserves to send after a retreating force of 50,000 men across open ground. What pursuit there was took some additional Persian lives, but the bulk of the Persian army fell back toward Ammonius in diminished but not destroyed condition. Perotses had been beaten. He had not been annihilated. The sources record Persian casualties at more than 8,000 men, including Belisarius. Byzantine casualties are described as considerably lower, fewer than 5,000, according to Procopius's account. These numbers should be held as estimates. Procopius was writing about the victory of the man he served, and ancient casualty figures have a tendency to favor the side doing the counting. What is beyond reasonable doubt is the asymmetry. The larger force had suffered dramatically more losses. In a battle it entered with every structural advantage, more men, better cavalry, professional superiority in open field combat. The system had worked. The plain south of Dara was quiet. The bathhouse, inside the fortress walls, was never prepared. Perozes did not bathe in Dara that evening. This is where honest historical accounting requires us to look past the victory and see the fuller picture, because the story of Dara is not complete without what came after it. 1 year after the battle on that summer plain, Belisarius found himself at a place called Callinicum, on the Euphrates River, facing a Persian force under a commander named Azarethes. And the result was different from Dara in a way that reveals something important about the nature of military genius and its limits. Belisarius did not want to fight at Callinicum. He had assessed the position. The terrain offered him nothing like what the plain at Dara had offered once he had finished redesigning it. The Persian force had been raiding Syria and was now withdrawing. Belisarius had shadowed them, limited their ability to cause additional damage, and was watching them leave. His professional judgment said to let them go. A battle on Persian terms, on terrain that did not favor Byzantine methods, was unnecessary risk when the Persians were already moving toward the frontier. His soldiers disagreed, vocally, persistently, and with a collective stubbornness that Belisarius could not simply override. The Byzantine troops had been flushed by the Dara victory, and by chasing the Persians across Syria, they wanted to fight. They demanded a battle. According to the sources, Belisarius spent considerable time trying to reason with them, explaining why patience was the better course. He failed to convince them. Faced with the choice between an engagement on poor terms and the genuine risk of his own force mutinying, he prepared for battle. The Persians won. The defeat was not catastrophic. The Byzantine army was not destroyed. It withdrew across the Euphrates in reasonable order, and the Persians were too weakened themselves to follow up the victory into Byzantine territory. But it was a defeat. Belisarius was recalled to Constantinople. Formal charges of military incompetence were leveled against him. He was cleared. Justinian had been watching his general's career with enough attention to understand the distinction between what had happened in 530 and what had happened in 531. At Dara, Belisarius had controlled every variable he could control and produced a result that the numbers said was impossible. At Callinicum, he had been unable to control the most important variable of all, his own army's willingness to be commanded. These were different situations. The emperor understood the difference, and Belisarius was cleared and retained. The Iberian War ended not with another battle but with a negotiated agreement, the perpetual peace, also called the eternal peace, with the bitter irony that it lasted only until 540, was signed in 532. The terms were roughly symmetrical. Both sides held what they had held before the war, with adjustments for the minor frontier positions that had changed hands. Justinian paid the Sassanid court a substantial payment in gold as part of the settlement. The exact sum that changed hands is reported differently by different sources and cannot be stated with confidence, but it was significant. Think about what that means for a moment. The Byzantine Empire had won 2 significant field victories in the summer of 530 Dara in the south, and a separate engagement at a place called Satala in the north, where the general Sitters defeated another Persian army. 2 victories in the same season, and the treaty that ended the war still required Justinian to pay Persia in gold. This is the reality of warfare between matched great powers. Tactical brilliance translates into negotiating position, not free peace. Justinian needed the eastern frontier stabilized so he could pursue his larger ambitions in the western Mediterranean, the reconquest of Africa and Italy that would define his reign. Persia knew this. The payment in gold was the price of the peace Justinian needed more than Khosrow did. Belisarius went west, and his career accelerated into the campaign, for which he is best remembered by most people who know his name at all. Within a year of the perpetual peace, Justinian sent him to North Africa with approximately 15,000 soldiers, barely half the force he had commanded at Dara, to attack the Vandal kingdom that had occupied the former Roman province of Africa for over a century. Belisarius landed, fought 2 battles, and destroyed the Vandal kingdom in less than a year. He sent the Vandal king in chains to Constantinople and stood before Justinian to receive a triumph. Rome had not seen a triumph for an eastern campaign in generations. Italy followed. The Gothic War against the Ostrogoths was longer and more brutal and more complicated than Africa, and it consumed years of Belisarius's life. He took Rome itself with a small force through a combination of speed and deception. He then held Rome against a Gothic army, many times his size, through a siege that lasted more than a year, improvising defenses and conservation of force with exactly the kind of system building that had characterized Dara. He was less successful in the later stages of the Italian campaign, hampered by insufficient resources and inadequate support from an emperor who trusted him but was also wary of him, and he was eventually removed from command in Italy and replaced. His relationship with Justinian was never simple and was never entirely secure. He lived until 565, the same year that Justinian himself died, as it happens. He was accused of corruption in his later years, placed under some form of official investigation or house arrest, and cleared of the charges. The details are murky, and the later accounts may embellish them. He died without the wealth or the autonomous power that his military record might have justified in a different political system. Procopius, who had watched all of it from close range, described him as the finest military commander of his age. The scholarly consensus over the 15 centuries since has not significantly revised that verdict. Now, consider what Dara actually accomplished in the larger arc of history, because here the picture requires honesty about the limits of even brilliant victories. Dara did not save the Roman Empire. The battle in the summer of 530 was a remarkable tactical achievement, but it did not end the threat from Persia or permanently shift the balance of power on the Mesopotamian frontier. Khosrow I, Kavad's son, who became the Sassanid king within months of the battle after his father's death in September 531, negotiated the perpetual peace with Justinian in 532, and then broke it in 540. His armies invaded Syria in force. They sacked Antioch, one of the great cities of the eastern Mediterranean, and carried its population into Persian territory. The wars between Byzantium and Persia resumed and continued, in various configurations and intensities, for another century. Both empires kept fighting, and the fighting kept costing them. Justinian's reconquest of the West, brilliant in strategic vision, exhausting in execution, drained Byzantine financial and military resources for decades. The plague that struck the Mediterranean world in 541 and 542, the great epidemic that modern scholars have called the Justinianic plague, killed enormous numbers of people in both empires and disrupted the economic foundations of both states. Persia and Byzantium were, by the early 7th century, in the final phase of their 7-century competition, a devastating war that saw Persian armies reach Egypt and the walls of Constantinople, followed by a Byzantine counteroffensive that pushed deep into Persian territory. Both sides were broken by the effort. And then, from the Arabian Peninsula, in the 630s and 640s, came armies that neither empire had prepared for. Within 2 decades, the Sassanid Persian Empire had ceased to exist as a political entity. Within a generation, Egypt, Syria, and the Holy Land had passed out of Byzantine control permanently. 2 superpowers that had spent centuries competing for the Mesopotamian frontier found, in the end, that the competition had consumed them both, leaving them too weakened to resist a force that had not existed as a military power when they had been at the height of their strength. Dara, in this long view, is a moment of extraordinary tactical brilliance in the middle of a conflict that had no resolution, a contest between 2 empires that were, in the deepest sense, doomed by their inability to stop fighting each other long enough to recognize the world that was changing around them. And yet, what Belisarius built on that flat plain in the summer of 530 was something worth understanding on its own terms, separate from the larger history of empires rising and declining. It was not simply a clever ditch. It was a demonstration of a particular kind of military intelligence, the ability to look at a situation where all the conventional measures pointed to defeat Identify the specific assumptions that the stronger side was operating on, and design conditions that made those assumptions fatal. He could not match the Persians in numbers. He could not match them in heavy cavalry. He could not rely on his infantry in open field. He had no natural terrain to help him. Everything that a conventional assessment of the situation said was working against him. So he stopped assessing the situation conventionally. He asked a different question. Not, "How do I fight this battle and win?" but, "How do I redesign this battle so that the things the Persians are best at become the things that hurt them most?" The answer was the trench, not as a defensive barrier that stopped the Persian army, but as a geometric enclosure that channeled it, compressed it, and exposed it to attack from directions that its own advance had created. The Persians were beaten not by a force stronger than them, but by the implications of their own professional competence, played against them by a commander who had thought the whole sequence through before a single soldier died. He drew his victory before anyone drew a sword. Today, the ruins of Dara sit in a village in Turkey's Mardin province. The village is called Oğuz, and its residents have built their homes over many centuries, partly from the stones of the ancient fortress cistern walls and carved thresholds, finding new purposes in the foundations of ordinary houses. Stretches of the ancient walls still stand. The great cisterns that supplied the city with water through sieges are still visible, remarkable in their scale. The plain to the south looks, to a modern eye, entirely unremarkable, flat, dusty in summer, the kind of ground that draws no attention. The trench is gone, filled in by 15 centuries of accumulating sediment and undisturbed agricultural use. The battlefield is invisible. Scholars who have visited the site and compared the landscape with Procopius's account have been able to identify where the trench likely ran, where Pharis's hill probably stood, where Peroses's camp at Ammonius was located. The geometry can be reconstructed from the text and the terrain. But standing on that ground today, you would not know that anything happened there, except that it did. A commander in his late 20s, working alongside an experienced co-commander, stood behind a ditch they had built together and waited for one of the most powerful armies in the world to make good decisions. Every good decision the Persian commander made was the wrong one. Every professional instinct the Sassanid cavalry followed led them deeper into a system that had been specifically designed to reward those instincts with destruction. The bathhouse was never prepared. The dust settled on the plain south of Dara, and a young general, not yet 30 years old, stood in the quiet that followed and began to think about what he would design next. If you want to follow that career further, the campaigns in Africa, the siege of Rome, the years in Italy, those are worth a video of their own. The tactics Belisarius used in those later engagements carry the same signature as what happened at Dara. Preparation over improvisation, system over instinct, the patient redesigning of conditions before the moment of decision. Dara was where it started. It was the clearest version of it, the one where the design and the execution aligned most precisely. One question worth sitting with. If you were Peroses that morning commanding a force twice the size of the enemy, having already sent the message about the bath, watching the Byzantine deployment across the flat ground, what would you have done differently? The Persian commander was not incompetent. The trap worked because he was competent. Because he did what competent professional soldiers do, in exactly the sequence that a competent professional trapper had anticipated. The answer to that question, if you can find one, tells you something about why this battle has been studied for 1500 years and will probably be studied for 1500 more.